Okay, hello everybody, and we're going to jump into another reading group. Um, Definitely at some point, it will be great to pass over the kind of like opening 10, 15 minutes to other people. I would love to do that. Sometimes I don't do it because by the time I think of it, it's too late. So at the end of this, maybe if someone wants to volunteer to do this, that would be great. Get a different voice from me. I will tell you a little bit about what I get out of this chapter, and then let's dive in. Another thing that I don't do often enough is to actually encourage you to underline certain paragraphs or passages that you want to talk about. So that's always helpful as well. As always, jump in anytime, but otherwise stick up your virtual hand, and that's even easier. I'll see you and jump over to you. Okay, so I guess the whole brilliant idea for any philosopher and any book is to kind of figure out what is the question. There's usually a question that animates a philosopher. Sometimes there's a question that animates their entire work. Sometimes it's a question that animates a book. Um, Books of essays are a little bit less like that, but usually in a book, there's a question. And if you understand the question that they're asking, it makes decoding the book a lot easier. Um, and these days, it's easier to find that out sometimes because sometimes you have to read the entire book to figure out the question the person's asking. But you can look at prefaces and often introductions tell you. Anyway, this book and Altizer as a whole, but this book is all about, of course, Godhead and the nothing, right? Nothingness is the central driving theme of this book. I'm only on chapter 3 myself, actually. I've kind of just a chapter ahead. But I can already tell, obviously, every chapter is going to be a deepening of the nothing. Um, with Altizer, there's some terms that keep coming back, nothingness, coincidence of opposites, apocalypse, dialectism, dialectical thinking. Those are the kind of like recurring themes in Altizer. And I would say, I don't know if there's a theologian who is more dialectical than Altizer in the 20th century. So Altizer was a bit of a mad guy. I met him once, and he took a real liking to me at first, and then he took a real disliking to me. But he was quite paranoid. He had kind of suffered from paranoia. Uh, he was a towering man, a man of great incredible intellect and incredible presence. And he heard me speak about icon transformance art. I did a talk at a conference, and some people were responding to what I call at the moment Church of the Contradiction, and he loved that. This is an aside, by the way, sorry, nothing to do with the book, but he loved it and invited me to have a drink with him. And what he said at the time was that he wanted radical theology to have a practice, and they never cracked that. And he felt that what I was doing was potentially that. And he said he wanted to set up a type of church of cabaret and do all this stuff. So anyway, we got on quite well in that. Um, uh, but he was a bit mad, as I say, and the madness I think added to his work. It comes out in his work, but he's a man of extremes. And when I talk about him as an extreme dialectical thinker, we talked about this last week, of course, is that if you don't even mentions this in the chapter or in chapter 3 mentions this, like he says, basically, if you're not a dialectical thinker, you're not going to like what I'm doing. And oh, here, by the way, John, do you want to jump in on something there? Oh no, that's gone.
Yeah, I just wanted to. I'm really interested in like schizophrenia and paranoia and that side of sort of the psychoanalysis. So, like when I was reading this chapter and reading Althusser, I always get that sense that there's something of psychosis in here. So, like when you say that he's mad, just I don't mean to interrupt and to break
Oh,
your train of thought, but can you just like when we use signifiers like mad, like are you speaking metaphorically? Are you speaking a little clinically? Like, can you just expand on that before we kind of get move on, if that's possible?
oh, absolutely. No, that's good. And yeah, when I use the term mad, I'm kind of using it clinically as in psychotic. Yeah, yeah. Now, obviously, I'm not a psychoanalyst. I can't analyze him. So touch a grain of salt, everybody, please. But there's definitely, lots of things that would show that he, was psychotic and had, schizophrenic tendencies and paranoid tendencies. And he even, I think, goes into that in his I'm pretty sure he wrote an autobiography called Living the Death of God. And I think it's in there because I think, again, look into this yourselves or correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he talks about how he was turned down as a minister for his congregation because of kind of certain issues with madness. So yeah, when I say mad, yeah, psychotic dimensions, which kind of you can feel in the book sometimes. Um, yeah, and so with that dialectical movement, you have he goes by the absolute affirmation, right? The absolute affirmation, and then that goes into the absolute negation, as far as you can go into the absolute negation, and then the apocalypse, the negation of negation, in going into the absolute light, you go into the absolute darkness, and then in the absolute darkness, a new light is found. This piercing blackness that is light. Uh, and so in chapter 3, it probably goes into the most extreme version of that, where he basically says the coincidence of God and the devil. That, so it's kind of going that direction, an absolute good and absolute evil. So this is his whole way of thinking. So in chapter 1, we have him exploring this notion that in modernity, we enter into the most sophisticated or deepest atheism and meaninglessness and nihilism. And there's thinkers like Nietzsche and others and Blake, and these thinkers of nihilism. You got existentialism. And then he is, as I say, the theologian who finds in this um, basically something equivalent to the absolute death of God, right? So this is kind of not the move away from Christianity, but really the recollection of the movement of Christianity, absolute kenosis, absolute self-emptying, absolute nothingness, that then gives birth to to a different understanding of God. So that's chapter 1 we looked at last week. And then this chapter, from what I remember and recall of it, and say I'll do the broad up brushstroke first, and we can delve in. But the broad brushstroke is, and this is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. It goes like, kind of at the core of religion, all religion is sacrifice, and sacrifice is a kind of enacting of absolute negation. Like, to sacrifice is to destroy, to give up, to to burn something, without return. It's non-economic, right? In economy, you can kind of sacrifice, but you don't really. You sacrifice your money, but you get the chocolate bar in exchange. So there's no real sacrifice in the market as such, except for labor power, right? Forget that. But in pure sacrifice, you're basically giving up something without return. And in this chapter, he, I think last week we talked about this. I'm so glad I was reading that book by Lisa McCullough at the same time. She's actually one of the best experts on Altizer. She knew Altizer, was very close to him, and she wrote that book in Simone Weil, that I mentioned last week. And in a way, if the primordial act of God is not the first act, the beginning, is not an act of so much creation, but an act of retraction, an act in which God has to become less so that space can be created, so that nothingness can be created for the universe to form. So the first act of God is not to kind of create something, but rather to canonically self-empty. Uh, then sacrifice, in a way, is religiously participating in this kenotic act. So for Altizer, again, religion is deeply important because archaic religion is a type of giving up of something, a sacrifice of something that replays the kenotic emptying of God. And at one point in the chapter, I think he says, sacrifice is always a recalling. It's not a call, it's a recalling. So it's a repetition of something in the past. And it's the repetition of a primordial sacrifice, a primordial loss, um, that that begins everything, a transformative loss. And again, modernity is very important for him in the sense of like potentially getting to the point of a sacrifice without return. So maybe in some religion, in religions we pray to God, we sacrifice in order to get God to do something, right? Well, God, if you do X, Y, and Z, I'll build a church in your name or whatever. But like pure sacrifice, pure giving up without return, it's almost again like this dialectical thing. He wants to get to the most extreme form of sacrifice. This reminds me, and I'm sure he's maybe loosely connected with this, with Freud talks about the difference between what he called primal repression and secondary repression. Primal repression is a type of, it's not something you it's not something you repress. It's there from the beginning. It's the lack that pre-exists us, or the lack out of which we arise. It's something that, so secondary repression is I repress something because it's bad. I negate something. To repress is almost to create a void, to forget, an act of forgetting. But before I can actively forget, there's a primordial repression, which is more basic than that, which is a type of forgetting or a type of lack that predates the subject. So you've got this primal repression and the secondary repression. And in the same way, you've got like sacrifices in religion, and then you've got this primal sacrifice, this at the very beginning of everything, there is this kenotic event. And all the sacrifices, I guess, kind of in a sense, recall or relive that sacrifice. So the way I read this is, in one way, he's going, okay, let's think about God as this radical negativity. And then let's think of the core of religion as a type of, I guess, participation in that negativity, a salvatory, transformative participation in this kenotic self-emptying. And then in the third chapter, he connects this probably more controversially still with evil itself, because evil in the Western tradition especially, but evil has been connected with privation, with lack. So he's going to connect this God, sacrifice, evil, all connected with this radical negativity. Is that all I want to say? Yeah. Okay, so there's the overall something. Does anybody want to start us off with anything in the chapter, with any comments or questions? I got to open the chapter here. I've got it somewhere on my computer. Lost.
Can I go on?
Oh, please jump ahead. Go
Go
for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you then say that crucifixion is the absolute sacrifice?
Oh, I can hardly. Could you repeat that? Sorry. You're a bit.
I'm sitting by the ocean and the beach, so it's a little.
Right.
I'll try again. Would you say that the absolute sacrifice then is the crucifixion? I understand about the primordial and us living. The primordial I understand is a mode of being that is there for everyone. But the absolute sacrifice is that sacrifice of Christ.
Yes, definitely. I mean, from the way I read it and connecting with last week is, in a way, the very beginning of everything, the very beginning of the universe is the sacrifice almost of the Godhead, of kind of a kenotic self-emptying. In Christianity, this is seen and replicated or recalled in the crucifixion of Christ. So crucifixion of Christ is, in a sense, the kenotic self-emptying that perhaps in a way reveals the truth that God is always canonically self-emptying. And for Altizer, and please anyone else jump in, he wants to add to this, I see him as the reason why he's really interested in Christianity is because he thinks Christianity has this extreme form of death. that death is actually in God, right? That which is very, even in obviously a lot of Christian theology, God doesn't kind of like die in order for the universe to be created. That's kind of like a foreign idea. But Altizer kind of wants to say that in Christ, where we see literally the death of God, um, this is the religion that is the most extremely dialectic. I mean, he thinks that dialecticism is in Eastern religions, but in terms of Christianity, it's so extremely dialectic because, yeah, in the crucifixion, death is the apocalyptic opening of new life, and death is in the very heart of God. I'll just read the
Yeah,
first. Oh, go ahead. Oh, just jump in.
no, you read the first line so you could give me some time to formulate my thoughts.
Oh, great. I just opened it up there. I thought it was quite good. So he says, we know that the deepest and most universal movement of archaic religion is the movement of sacrifice, one which is the ultimate foundation of all cultic ritual, if not the innermost movement of ritual itself, and which can preserve itself even in the abatement or transfiguration of ritual. Um, so, there you go. In the very opening chat, the thing that Altizer does, he says, we know, and he kind of, Helen does this a lot as well. She'll say, like, obviously, things like that, and then say something that's actually very deep and not very obvious at all. So Altizer will make these sweeping statements, but that sweeping statement is that, the deepest, the most universal movement of archaic religion is the movement of sacrifice. And I'm sure that's, people might want to maybe critique that as such, but that's the opening gambit, is going like, whenever you look at religions and rituals, like at the core of religion is sacrifice, and that's, you can't really get away from that. Anyway, John, yeah, jump in, man.
See, this is where I think the psychotic interpretation is helpful, though, because, right, I think if you look at psychosis from a clinical perspective, right, in a certain sense, it's good at generating creativity because at least from a psychoanalytic perspective, it taps into unconscious fantasy in a way that's logical secondary processing doesn't. Um, but right, there's obvious moments of frustration in doing this as philosophy, precisely because, like, well, the obvious question kind of becomes, if there's a primordial sacrifice at the dawn of creation, which seems to be his argument, right? God self-negates in order to kind of create the world, then how is it that the death of God in the crucifixion in 2000, in 0 AD, like is there, like, what's left to sort of self-negate at that point? Right, so it works kind of on a very creative sort of level and centering the idea of, negativity and thinking this idea of self-negation through. But there's like some philosophically systematic problems. Like, if this is a primordial sacrifice, then what exactly is the crucifixion? Like, how does God sort of does he self-negate himself twice? Is there anything left over? Is there a transcendence left over? Like, he doesn't have the systematic, like, he has the creativity and the kind of fantasy projection to come up with very cool ideas, but systematizing it into anything that you can kind of grab hold of is impossible, I think, because there are these contradictions that he can't resolve.
Yeah, that, I mean, that's an interesting point. I was talking to a friend the other day, just yesterday, who is kind of like psychotic. Well, he is psychotic, and he's kind of having a bit of a manic episode, and as a lot of psychotics do, very into the Illuminati and very into the ideas that there's a cabal of people controlling everything, usual kind of stuff. But exactly what you said is the frustration of talking to them is um, it all holds together. There's a lot of logic, but there's something quite frustrating in the details. You can't quite kind of it's very persuasive in its grandiose kind of like vision, but yeah, you don't feel you can grab hold of the individual elements very easily.
Well, and it almost feels like there's something of like Freudian primary process thinking that two contradictory things can be held true at once, and it's almost like it doesn't, like that question doesn't really seem to even arise for Altizer. It's almost like he never problematized, like, well, where does the self-negation actually take place?
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to read more of him because I go like, and because he's such a great thinker, he's so smart. And sometimes whenever someone has something like psychosis and is incredibly brilliant, they obviously come up with brilliant stuff. So I know he has a book on Jesus and stuff, and so I'd love to see if he can provide an answer. But yeah, at the moment, I see what you're saying, and sadly don't have a good comeback for you. Yes, and oh, Altizer says X, Y, and Z might be out there. I think you've probably read as much or maybe more Altizer than I have. So I'm not sure. But Courtney, jump in.
Um, yeah, how I understand this primordial is that it's in the heart of being. So even we as human beings, um, in our nature, given to be sacrificed. It's a natural thing to us. Like when you love, you're willing to give something up. Um,
I'm
and
struggling to hear you
like,
a little bit. I'm afraid I don't know if anybody else is.
oh,
I'm sorry.
oh, maybe I should move some other places. I'll try to do that. Jump in somebody else.
Okay, I'll let Courtney jump in while you're repositioning yourself. Courtney.
Okay, I have to figure out every time I have to figure out how to unmute my microphone. Um, I was just going to ask about the what you said that this ultimate
Oh, we've lost you.
thing without turn,
Oh, we lost you
or
for a
if
second
that's
there. Could
oh,
you repeat?
sorry. Okay. You were saying that this ultimate sacrifice, this kenotic self-emptying, that we then participate in through the crucifixion, um, that the ultimate participation in it basically would be to make the sacrifice without any return. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. That he's saying, so hopefully that's right. But you keep going. I think that
Yeah.
anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was just thinking, in what way does that connect to Julie Reiche's work? Because that seems like something she would say, like
Yes.
almost verbatim.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I texted Julie the other day more about Simone Weil, saying about that she would really enjoy the book that I was reading. But I think as well, Altizer, this fits quite neatly. I mean, the reason why it's actually difficult for me sometimes to at this time reading him, it's very different reading him today, where is that I'm trying to kind of make sure I don't just read into him what I think, because it's not very far from what I mean by communion. Whenever I talk about Church of the Contradiction as a participation in this shared lack, it's kind of like, God, this chapter seemed to be saying that, and that's similar to Julie Reich's um, negative psychoanalysis, where there is no healing, there's no help. There's this kind of, in a sense, an acknowledgement of that we are a constellation of death. There's an acknowledgement of a fundamental trauma without, just in itself. So yeah.
Yeah. So my dilemma there, just in thinking through it, how that would work itself out in real life is, even if I go into it not expecting a return, at least intellectually, I know there's going to be one. So
Yeah.
how do I do this? How do I do this without expecting anything? I don't even know if that's possible.
Yes. Yeah, because as soon as you lose your life in order to find it, can you really lose your life? But in a sense, when you're a
Exactly.
dialectical thinker, you know that there's
Yeah. So
yeah.
so every time you you realize you have lost your life, and then you have found it, then you have to lose it again.
Yeah.
It's like it never stops, which is beautiful, but also exhausting.
Yes. Tim, do you want to jump in on that or something else?
Yeah, I do. I was thinking about this whole thing really that Courtney was just describing, that I don't think we ever do anything without having some expectation of return. Okay, that's just the way we're built. I think you love because he first loved, we just always have something. So my current process here, and this is only throw out to you all for your feedback, is this primordial sacrifice is sort of like a lifestyle thing where we do this on an ongoing basis where we sacrifice, but our expectation is that which we know not of. In other words, we're going to get something back, but it's an openness. It's like, it may be good, it may be bad, it may be positive, it may be negative. But it's always going to be this cyclical thing that says, yeah, I'm going to sacrifice, and I'm going to probably get some return on this, maybe just a good feeling of sacrifice to start with.
Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in?
But do I want what the return's going to be? I don't know what the return's going to be. So that's kind of how I'm currently spinning this sacrificial lifestyle issue. Is like, we are drawn towards sacrifice due to primordial sacrifice, but I don't know what the response is going to be. And that's okay. I mean, I don't have to know. I'm not doing this in order to gain the favor of God, let's say. I'm not doing this in order to get the return of a love. I might get all that, but that's not driving me. My drive is the sacrifice, knowing there's going to be something that I don't know what it'll be, or whatever that perspective is worth.
Yeah. Sorry, you cut out briefly, but I got all of that. There was a wee brief moment you cut out, and I thought you just stopped halfway through, but then I heard you come back.
I'll try to
Oh,
jump in again then. Is it better now?
yeah,
Okay.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. But then I'll ask a question. He's talking about Golgotha. Do you say Golgotha? Golgotha of the spirit. I don't know if anybody can elaborate on that because I don't really get that.
Is there a paragraph or a line you can point to? Do you have it in front of you at all? No.
Yeah. I'll take a look.
Isn't that a quote from Phenomenology of Spirit?
Yeah, what was the quote again? To John, can you remember? Because I couldn't quite hear.
What is it? It's been a long time since I read Hegel. I think he says when he's talking about the crucifixion, he talks about it as the what does he say? Golgotha of the spirit. He uses the spirit kind of dies and then resurrects, and I think Hegel. I forget the terminology. He has some of that beautiful poetics towards the end of Phenomenology of Spirit.
Yeah.
Most of the entire text is like just horrible being in itself, being for itself. And then once in a while you get to a nice part where it's so poetic and beautiful and the rest is just horrible.
Yeah. Oh, Heidi, did you find it? No.
Yeah, I did. Yes, yes, I did. It's on page 18. The Calvary of the Absolute Spirit.
Yes.
On the middle of in the middle of the page.
Yeah, it says this crucifixion is the absolute self-negation or self-emptying of the Godhead itself, one realizing itself in the deepest depths of consciousness, depths which realize themselves in the full and final advent of the totality of self-consciousness. Here, the individual and historical realization of absolute sacrifice is apocalypse itself. For not only is this sacrifice the center of history, but it is the apocalyptic fulfillment and ending of history, or is so in that absolutely new and final historical destiny, which is sacrifice, and this sacrifice alone releases. So yeah, so this crucifixion is the Calvary of absolute spirit. Let me just read the first line here. Yet this twilight of the gods issues in the birth of the absolute religion, and the birth of Christianity is the advent of absolute self-consciousness. This advent is inseparable from the individual and historical realization of absolute sacrifice. Yeah, very typically Altizer. Do you, Bill, want to jump in on that, or Kyle, or do you want to do any interpretations? I was going to do a quick breakdown of that paragraph. Will I do that first? Okay, so the crucifixion is the absolute self-negation, self-emptying of the Godhead. So that's it. In Christ, we see the kenotic self-emptying, exactly. One realizing itself in the deepest depths of consciousness, depths which realize themselves in the full and final advent of the totality of self-consciousness. Here's how I read that. I read that in the sense of, for Hegel, self-consciousness arises through negation and through a sense of being, to be conscious of an object is to be conscious of an object. To be self-conscious is to be conscious of yourself as an object. And to be conscious of yourself as an object means there's an alienation, there's a separation, there's some sort of self-emptying. So in this paragraph, I'm kind of going like, he's just making these connections between this self-emptying of God and the depths of consciousness, the very depths of consciousness being self-consciousness, which is I guess what he thinks results from this kenotic self-emptying of God. And this is historically realized. And yeah. Anybody else want to add anything to that paragraph? Or Heidi, what was your question in relation to that?
Oh, okay. Or
just what did it mean?
Yes, I was wondering why calls it the Calvary of the Absolute Spirit is not all of a sudden he's talking about the Spirit.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And for him, Absolute Spirit is really the name. I mean, maybe this isn't completely correct, but like spirit is the name for this absolute negation, this absolute negativity in the world. It's almost like Father. So I guess you could think of it like God is not at one with God's self, and the name for that is Jesus. And then Spirit is the name for the not at oneness. So you've got God who's not at one with God, and that's Jesus, God and Jesus. And the not at oneness is Spirit. So Spirit, or Absolute Spirit, is the self-consciousness of God, even because God becomes conscious of God through self-alienation, and so I think that's a way of thinking about spirit. But does anybody else feel that that's right, or yeah.
But isn't he, I think somewhere else is talking about when he talks about the immanence of God in the world, he's talking exactly about the Spirit.
Yeah.
Something that happened after Christ. So now God is not transcendent, he's immanent, and then he's talking about the age of the Spirit somewhere else. And I guess that's also why I was asking it, because he is talking about the Calvary of the Absolute Spirit, but isn't it the resurrection of the Absolute Spirit in the world? I don't know if he's talking about the Spirit in different ways or what's happening. I don't know if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, spirit, again, like you can think of as like the epoch of the Holy Spirit is almost like God now has died and exists virtually through the community of believers. This is the epoch of the Holy Spirit. This is the Absolute Spirit, is that the this negation writ large. I don't know if that makes sense. Does anybody else want to help me out?
Well, maybe I could jump in here if Bill and Kyle don't mind. I think they're going to take us in a tiny bit of a direction, so I'll try to just be brief. I think this goes back to what I said last week a little bit, because I know and I kind of agree with you that he's one of the, he's probably the biggest name in 20th century theology that works with Hegelian philosophy. But I never quite know if he's doing the same thing as Hegel or not, because he's using a lot of the Hegelian terms in a similar way that Marx does in his Hegelian heavy period of the young Marx. But it almost feels like there's a bit of an inversion, because at least the way that I read it, I tend to have the more heavier original metaphysical reading of Hegel. I'm not quite convinced by some of the new post-metaphysical Hegelian literature, but it seems to me that what Hegel's basic premise is that, look, he's an idealist, so he thinks that ideas are the most real sort of categories in the world and not matter. But he's also driven by the impulse that, unlike Plato, he doesn't think that ideas in the abstract are somehow very real. What he wants to do is to essentially say that the ideas are real through an actual physical material world, that they actualize themselves in some sort of objective reality. And so what Hegel's sort of pantheistic vision of divinity is that he thinks that God basically has to actualize himself as an embodied material world that lives through human consciousness, essentially. And I think this for him is what absolute spirit is. That Hegel's essentially saying that, look, that you can't have this reified, abstract, transcendent idea of God. That God, what Holy Spirit is for him is the idea that, God lives in the souls of each and every human being and actualizes himself in the world, because otherwise God is just this abstract sort of nothingness. That pure ideas this is why pure being is pure nothingness. And so what you get with absolute spirit is the unity of sort of matter and spirit, and that's sort of the absolute unity that realizes itself through humanity. I don't know quite always what Altizer's like. He's taking these terms from Hegelian discourse, but he's putting his own spin on it, and I'm not always quite sure what his spin is.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
That was a nice summary of of Hegel's absolute spirit. That was very good. Thank you. Here, Bill, jump in.
Yeah, following John's sort of the same thing all throughout the book is how does he differ from Hegel? And this chapter really sounded like he resonated strongly with Hegel, but he did say it's only that the mature Hegel takes this primordial sacrifice thing, which everyone understands, and makes it conceptual. And so that's what I'm really excited about. So I don't sort of disagree with Tim. I don't think I always do an action expecting something in return. Sometimes I just do something for the fun of it, or hey, let's just try this and see what happens. I'm sure Tim does that too. But I don't think it's as transactional as capitalism, let's say, wants us to. We should behave. But 3 points. Now I know I usually make 20, and I know I talk too fast, but I will talk more slowly. New Bill, 3 points. Courtney and John. John, excellent question about, so what did God do new through killing his son? And it wasn't the first Genesis thing good enough. So I used to read the Bible, it's like God did this, he did this, he did this, he did this. And so there was the age of this, there was the age of this, and then crucifixion supposedly established the Church of the New Covenant, blah, blah, blah. And then, thanks to Rob Bell, a more useful interpretation is the Bible is not a history of what God has done. It's a history of how humans slowly come to understand what God has done. So it's like, it was there in Genesis, right? The chaos and negativity. But as Altair, the expert in history religion, documented, well, people took it to mean like literally you have to kill animals and do that over and over, and that's how you please your gods and blah, blah, blah. And so guys, look, Abraham, it's not about killing or sacrifices. You're gonna have to choose between, me or the sacrifice thing. So that was the end of that. Or maybe the crucifixion was the end of animal. But so he maybe had to do this killing his son, or Jesus being killed by authorities, which to me is not that big a deal. Every day there's hundreds of people that are killed by authorities, so I don't know why it's like the ultimate sacrifice. But I'm just pretending I'm a Christian for the sake of this comment. So I think it's more like Christians needed reminder. It's like, yeah, see, this is what should be going on. It's not the animal sacrifices. So very much what Courtney said. All the time we should be renewing ourselves, right? And I also disagree a bit that that's hard. It's actually hard to keep my 5-year-old identity at my advanced age. That's hard. It's much easier for me to say, oh, it's a new day, and I learned this on Pete's Zoom, and so I'll go in this direction. And so I think we should die and renew ourselves every single day, not once every 2,000 years or once every Martin Luther. So I think very much the point is, yeah, if you think you figured it out, guess again. And there's so the second point I only do two is the Rosetta Stone sentence in this chapter was, Altizer said, sacrifice is negativity. Okay, now it makes a lot more sense. So it's not really about sacrifice. That's what people understand. That's what religions do. They emphasize sacrifice, and mystic cults, they're always killing a bull or this or that. So, but he said the mature Hegel abstracted that and conceptualized it. It's not about, a sacrifice. It's about negativity. So now we can tie it into perhaps mature Hegel or main Hegel and Todd McGowan and others. So back to the same question, is he just sort of explaining Hegel with more of a, well, explain like, so the big breakthrough is, third point, have to cheat, is he's saying, forget about doing that primordial sacrifice stuff over and over and over. That's wrong. And that's the problem with the world is, lots of religions say, oh, we need to do sacrifice. We need to remember, that big sacrifice. And he's saying there's a tension, and don't do that. Do something new, escape from that, right? And so I got really excited that he's saying, no, you are transforming that sacrifice, not to keep doing over and over, but to take it in a very different direction. That's why it's a really hard book, because it sounds like he's saying, oh, primordial sacrifice or Freudian primordial, whatever, that's what controls us. Yeah, maybe, but it's so much better if you stop playing that game and transform it. And, he uses his favorite word is reverse, just taking a completely, but that's hard to understand. I think more should be said about that, but he drops that every 10 pages or so. It's not same old, same old. It's like, do the opposite.
Yeah.
And
Could I try and give
that's
an
very
example?
exciting.
Yeah, that's very good. I think that's very well said, man. And yeah, in your first point, you're saying kind of in a way that, like Nietzsche once said, after the death of God, it's like thunder and lightning. The lightning hits, but the thunder hasn't been heard. So in some respects, something is unfolding in history that has already occurred. Very good. And the other point you reminded me of, Todd McGowan's critique of capitalism is interesting, because his critique is not that people sacrifice in capitalism, because there's lots of sacrifice, obviously. So we sometimes fantasize about finishing sacrifice, but the problem is partly we we don't get to directly enjoy our sacrifice and collectively benefit from it or whatever. So in a way, it's not that you want to get beyond sacrifice, but there's something about, say, I suppose, having a child or something that's so profoundly I mean, this is what I like about Julie. Julie basically says to
Yeah,
be a
that's
mother
Julie
is,
right there. Yeah.
yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, I love it when she says being a mother is the most horrific thing. It's like it's death. It's just death. And I was like, brilliant, because in a way that's very Altizer, and it's like almost you have to see how this child destroys you, but it's in that, and somehow there that destruction is sublimated into the greatest love. Not for everybody, whatever, but that, and I think, I don't know if that's what you're saying, but in some respects, yeah, it's like, it seems like Altizer is saying, yes, instead of negatively repeating sacrifice, but there's something about sacrifice that is its own sublimation. I don't know, but Kyle, do you want to jump in?
Sure, Pete. Really good to be back with y'all. Just a quick bit of context. I've stepped away from kind of pyrotheological environment for a little bit, and just today, on a whim, just gonna jump in, and I just got too excited by a couple things here. I just want to share a couple more anecdotal thoughts regarding personal experience and how it ties into this passage. So, um, I guess I would just like to offer up the idea, and I know there's a deep critique here of the psychedelic experience. Uh, I've encountered that before, and I have fully yet to understand that critique. I guess I would just offer up a couple things. There's a growing body of research, compelling research regarding what's going on within like the Greek mystery cults, and that's where I'd focus. Is I think it's like page 16 right through like page 18 on my PDF here of the book. Right, he's talking about this the sacrifice within the Greek mystery cults. There's growing research that much of the rituals of like the Eleusinian mysteries um, were actually facilitated through psychotropic psychedelic substances. Now, that aside, I just like to say I had my first psychedelic experience myself a couple months ago, and I just got too excited reading this because I think there's a lot of coincidence. Um, I would offer up that possibly with the psychedelic experience, there's a couple dimensions that coincide with his idea of sacrifice. One, Tim, getting back to your point about how to think through the role that expectation plays, you know, and how expectation might um, possibly uh, pose a barrier or a problem, right, for the idea of like a total self-emptying. I would offer up that uh, if you're taking psychedelic mushrooms for the first time, you really, really, really do not know what's going to happen on the other side. That's absolutely what happened to me. And so I would just say, to me, that is one site of experience that absolutely uh, defies expectation. So in that sense, I guess for the first time I'm thinking through, oh my gosh, this feels like a ritual sacrifice kind of movement. I just thought that was really interesting. And then the second movement would be, where Altizer here talks about, this uh this dialectical emptying, um, but also a full presence, right? The ritual sacrifice draws up something of the ground. I think at some point in this passage he talks about the ground of being, right? This kind of Tolkienian language. That also to me highly resonates with the psychedelic experience. Um, what came through for me, um, in an ultimate sense, was this death, absolute dying, but a simultaneous experience of deep, deep presence, in the sense that as the ego dies, as the world knowing, right, the world concept, um, absolutely is annihilated. Um, there's a return. It comes back in a sense of a deep unity, of a presence that there's some kind of primordial connection that you are participating in. I think especially with like a psychedelic mushroom, this is talked about very often. So anyway, I was too excited to read this to think how the degree to which this seems to coincide with the testimonies of many people, deep into a psychedelic experience, and the degree to which it resonates with his idea of sacrifice. But I think especially this concept that, and it's so hard to talk about if you've never had this experience, but I couldn't help it, just in the sense that, you know, um, it's this idea that there is possibly a place, there is possibly a way of incarnating again, right? the the nothingness, the universal nothingness that you pass into, several hours into the experience, right? It also undergoes it also has its own sacrifice in becoming, you know, reduced, quote unquote, to neurochemical physical processes, right? The experience is one of a totality, right? Of a union with this universal nothingness, this groundness. But at the same time, after a few hours, you know, okay, this nothingness in a way gave itself over to these physical, right, uh neurochemical processes that we can understand, that expire, right, that are totally incarnate. So anyway, just a couple reflections on that, on that front. I was just too excited not to speak on that, but
yeah, I appreciate you. I appreciate you sharing that experience as well. That sounds like it was a really profound experience, mate. That's brilliant.
yeah.
I'm actually working with a friend of mine, to maybe do a conference in America about psychedelics and radical theology. Because I'm very interested in some of those questions and some of those experiences. My main issue with a lot of the thinking around psychedelics is it's very woo-woo, but with the way you're talking about it, I really like, and I think, I think there's a way of thinking about psychedelics in relation to some of these ideas in radical theology that's really, really useful. So I really appreciate you sharing that, mate. I really do. Anything else on that before we move on to Courtney? Because I'm guessing Courtney's not there to talk about psychedelics necessarily. Tim, do you want to jump in?
Oh, well, I wasn't going to talk about psychedelics either, but I did want to pick up on what Kyle was kind of continuing to expand upon in our conversation, and that's the expectation issue. I know Altizer and other writings, and I wish I could remember them. It goes all the way back to our Atheism for Lent series that we did on Death of God. I don't even know when that was, but he said that the death of God ushers in a new messianic expectation, meaning we don't know what the next iteration is going to look like. That's part of the, the sacrifice is present because there will be something else of which we still know not what, which is also very Caputo. He's like this insistence of God that perhaps of what might happen may be good, may not be good. That's kind of where I sit. It's like, we're still wondering what this is all going to look like, and it's okay if it looks like anything, or it looks like nothing. Who knows? And I know Altizer really seemed to make a strong point of that I've never forgotten.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, there's something about that commitment to this dialectic where you just kind of, you go, okay, if I believe in this process, we just go. And like Tillich ended The Courage to Be in that way, where he says the God who arises after the God of meaning disappears, but he's almost going, can't even, like, well, Bonhoeffer definitely said it's like, I don't know what's going to arise on this, in this pure giving up, this pure death, this pure nothingness, but it's almost like a faith in resurrection. You don't know what the resurrection is going to be, and that's why it's apocalyptic, an absolute end that's going to create an absolute beginning. And again, Kyle, just coming back to I think that, some psychedelic experiences are a very powerful way of experiencing that. Yeah. Courtney.
Well, I will just briefly say something about psychedelics, of which I have not had any experience because I was a kid in the 80s and I'm still getting rid of all the kids don't do drugs messages.
Just say no. Yeah.
Plus, I'd be concerned with how it would interact with all the medications I take. But I wonder if that could not be a requirement, but maybe a recommendation for anyone who's going to go into politics. Because, if you have that kind of experience, like what Kyle is describing, that maybe it would change how you think the world should be arranged and as far as how we all live together on this planet. Maybe it would have some kind of benefit. I don't know. It's just a random thought that popped in my head. Mainly though, I wanted to address something that Bill said. And Bill, this is not a criticism or a pushback, just a food for thought kind of thing. You were saying that that you disagree that anytime we sacrifice, we always have some kind of ulterior motive, expecting some kind of return. And you said sometimes we sacrifice just for fun, or just because. And I'm not saying I agree with Altizer or with Julie Reish about that we can't sacrifice without expecting return, or that we should try to sacrifice without expecting return. But if I'm doing something just for fun, then that emotional fun is a type of return. It doesn't have to be I do something because I expect someone to do something back for me. It could just mean I'm doing this thing and I know I'm going to get some kind of feeling that feels good to me. That's my return. And I don't know if it's possible to do something good without some part of us hoping for that good feeling. I don't know, it's just a thought.
Yeah. That makes me think of, again, Simone Weil. I keep coming back to, I'm sorry, it's because she's been very profoundly, and I know, Courtney, you've been reading Weil as well, I think. Yeah, so
she gets in your head.
she gets in your head. She gets in your head. She does, and she does something very similar to Lacan, but the move from desiring objects to eventually desiring desire. But it's a very, very difficult path, and it's a very difficult thing to do, et cetera, et cetera. But it's almost like she seems to say that there is a way to get to the point where, to put it in different words, there's sacrifice for something, but then there is sacrifice for itself. But it's almost like this, I like the way John Caputo said it once, is if it exists, and he takes this from Derrida, is the gift, which is sacrifice because you don't get anything back. The gift can only ever happen when you don't see it. Because as soon as you're conscious of it, there's always, as you said, a return, like for fun, even if it's just because I want to do this because I get, I feel good for it. So for Derrida, it's almost like the gift, if it exists. I think that's the term he uses. The gift, if it exists, is basically always behind your back. But yeah, what Altizer and Weil and Caputo and these people seem to be saying is that yeah, it's impossible to sacrifice without return, except when we don't know we're doing it or something. I don't know. It's a very interesting kind of difficult thing. Bill, do you want to respond at all before we move on to Heather? They're good.
No, I think it is a complex question. I think maybe again, speaking too fast.
Yeah.
I probably don't sacrifice without expecting return, but I do lots of things. I think I was just sort of saying, sometimes I like to think I'm not selfish. Sometimes I like to think I'm doing something for someone else. And that's all I meant. Sometimes I do things without an expectation that next week that person will do the same thing for me.
Yeah. And that might be the Derridean thing. That sounds to me like you're saying what Derrida says. Like the example Caputo uses is the teacher who helps a student but doesn't even think about it. They kind of do it, and then they don't go home and tell their partner.
Yeah, that's it. I don't think about things.
Yes, it kind of, and that's what I love about that Bible verse. The right hand gives without the left hand knowing. The way I interpret that is a beautiful way of saying that you somehow give without knowing you're giving. Yeah.
Unless it's big, right? I mean, like opening a door, I don't overthink it, but big things for sure.
Yeah.
If I'm investing, 5 years of my life, I better get something back.
Yes. I mean, it's almost like at the end. Well, I don't know if how often this happens, but I guess, at certain points in your life, somebody might say, "Oh, 5 years ago, you did this or you said this." And you're like, "Oh, I didn't even know I gave anything to you," but it was a gift to them, but you didn't even know it was a gift to them. And it's actually annoying they told you, because now you can feel good about yourself and you destroy the giftedness of it, But there's those little gifts that maybe you've given and you never knew. And that's kind of the Derridean gift. Heather, jump in.
Well, I've been listening to everybody, and I can't help but think about a session that you had with Julie Reishi, where you all were sitting in a living room somewhere, and she was talking. And every time we would circle back around to, well, but yeah, but you do get something out of this, she would say, I'm not going to say that. I'm just not going there. I'm not going to say that. And where it ended up with her, and she got a lot of pushback from listeners, was people would say to her, but what you're essentially saying then is there's no good and there's no evil. There's no good and evil. And I can't help but think that that's somehow bound up in all of this. The collapse of good and evil, having to go hand in hand with the whole idea that sacrifice can't be pure sacrifice, can't be to get something back, can't be transactional. And as long as the framework of good and evil exists, you can't get away from sacrifice somehow being transactional, somehow there being a payoff, somehow there being an expectation attached. If I do A, I will get B. So but if there's some sort of and I'm not going to articulate this well because every time I talk to somebody about this, we end up getting into it. But I feel like there has to be, along with this idea, some kind of a collapse of good and evil. Even in the crucifixion, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's both. It's an evil thing. It's, some would say a redemptive thing. I think about, I was thinking about, as people were talking, the act of creating something, like if you're an artist or a musician, they would say, that their greatest moments of creativity were, like you just said, where they didn't set out to do it, like, oh, I was just sitting on the toilet one day and it just came to me, or I was in the tub and it just happened. And there wasn't like I'm setting out to create something. It just flowed through them. Mm-hmm. And yet when we go after something in the sense of, this is this good thing that I want to pursue, we get right into that space of, I'm sacrificing for a payoff. And I'm not really sure, how the collapse of good and evil exists. But Kyle, to your point, that's an experience that I've had in a psychedelic experience, which was this complete collapse of good and evil. And a lot of things that we would initially think might be dark and evil arose, and yet they were completely beautiful in that moment and completely almost hilarious in that moment. And so that's just my 2 cents throwing in there, is I think that we get hung up, just like in that session with Julie Reishi, I think where people got hung up on it was, but if you say there's no payoff, then where you end up in is there's no good and evil ultimately. And that's a hard pill to swallow if you collapse the two.
Yeah, and Heather, that's a great setup for chapter 3, because the next chapter is all about the collapse of good and evil, or the coincidence of opposites, as he says, of good and evil, which connects somewhat with what you're talking about. So actually, we'll say a few more things, but actually that we could just end right there because that's a great setup for next week, where potentially an even more head-bending chapter than the first 2 chapters is where he actually kind of offers a way of how he sees good and evil as interconnected. I have to say about chapter 3, just as a little hint of next week, is it's the only theodicy that I've ever read, justification of evil or whatever, that that kind of works potentially for me. Is so next week, good and evil, if we do chapter 3, we'll get right into the heart of everything, Heather, you're talking about, and very, very interesting. I'm realizing, so we're in the last 5-7 minutes. I was want to make a question I want to ask at this point is anybody completely lost at the moment? you can just say, be honest and ask any question you want. I want to make sure that if anyone's feeling very cast adrift, because this is very mind-bending stuff, this is your opportunity to ask a question or make a comment.
For what it's worth, Pete, you did say that anybody who wasn't into dialectics was not going to understand it. I am not into dialectics.
Yeah.
That's about all I can say at this point. There's an awful lot that I've got huge question marks all down the side of the page against in this, and it would take far too long for me to go through those. But yeah.
Do you want to mention just one of like just a like kind of what's your main, like what, whenever you're reading Altizer, is it possible for you to summarize your kind of main frustration? I mean, that might be very hard to do, but if there's a lot of them, but is there a kind of like a movement he makes that, I mean, you probably said it, it's dialectics maybe, but
I don't follow how negating something more produces you a positive. In fact, I don't follow how negating something produces a positive.
Okay. Yeah. And Andy, so you put your hand up there. Did you want to say something like in relation to Chris? No. Oh.
Actually didn't quite get everything he said. So
that's okay. I thought you were going like you were agreeing with him. Oh yeah. So yes, the thing about negating something in such a way that it kind of positivizes it is just, yeah, that doesn't sit right with you. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't sit right with me either. I wasn't schooled dialectic.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to get a grab of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's difficult, I find.
And Andy, you can jump in as well.
Yeah, I just want to add something. I don't know if it's going to help, but reading what caught my attention when he talked about saints. And I think that's probably maybe a good example of like what sacrifice could look like. Because I remember reading a book a while ago of Mother Teresa, and it was her private writings to her confessor that was a higher priest of whatever level. And actually just read a quick letter from her, and it's like, why is that everybody is so good to us? I have no answer but one deep gratitude. There's so much contradiction in my soul, such deep longing for God, so deep that it's painful, a suffering continual, and yet not wanted by God, repulsed, empty, no faith, no love, no zeal, souls hold no attraction. Heaven means nothing to me. It looks like an empty place. The thought of this means nothing to me, and yet this is the torturing longing for God. So that kind of like came to my mind when reading what sacrifice is and all that. So I don't know, maybe she's kind of like an example of what that might look like.
I think you're absolutely right, man. I know that letter well, actually, that you're reading, and I've always considered Mother Teresa's inner life to be a lived example of a type of dialectics, you know, where she feels this radical. And at one point, she even says that she realizes that in her experience of the absence of God, she identifies with Christ. Because, you know, Christ on the cross, who experienced no God, in a sense, so she kind of realized, in my experience of no God, in my absolute being forsaken by God, I stand with Christ. So yeah, I think that's Mother Teresa is a great example of what this can look like. Yeah, that's very good. Thank you. And I'll say this for anybody, I want to kind of go for anyone who's kind of like not going all the way with the dialectics, that the only thing you'll be able to say at the end of this book study is you've at least read a really good dialectical thinker, so you know it. You don't have to agree with it, but, you know, stick with it just to, you know, because then, you know, you'll know it inside out, because you can't get much more dialectic than this kind of book. It really goes for it. Oh yeah, John, final thought from you, and anybody else, just we'll do a final quick run around. So anybody else, stick your hands up. John, give us your ending thoughts.
maybe I could just give a quick example and a kind of everyday quotidian example of what Hegel's trying to get across with the idea that a negative is a positive, right? It's something like, I think it's at the end of the first volume of his history of philosophy, these lecture courses he gave, I think towards the end of his life. And he says that, I think of like an ascetic, someone who is really struggling to separate themselves and negate the body, right? So it's corporal mortification, this sort of ascetic, hermetic, religious tradition. Hermetic's not the right word, but my mind's starting to fray. What Hegel says ends up happening, and this is this is a very kind of just everyday example. It works a little differently with his logic, but he's essentially saying that, look, if you try to negate the body so much, what you end up doing is actually absolutizing the body, because your whole day is worried about what you're eating and what you're doing with your body. And so even though you're striving to negate it through, let's say, whether it's anorexia, whether it's religious sort of corporal mortification, your effort to negate the body actually positivizes the body, because it becomes so important that it actually witnesses this kind of dialectical reversal, that the body, what you do to the body becomes sort of like your absolute mode of being if you're anorexic, let's say. And so there's this weird sort of paradox between the negative and the positive. And I think that's sort of just, but it's not conceptual philosophy, but it's a nice little example of just kind of how he's thinking of dialectics and how a negative might become a positive.
Very good. Thank you, man. That's great. And Tim, last thought on you?
Well, I kept coming back to this section in the reading this week. It's in page 20, and it kind of wraps up for me the feeling or the description that we are all kind of going through more or less. It says, for the very enactment of primordial sacrifice inevitably overwhelms us, and does so most deeply when it is dissociated from our given religious traditions or our apparent or manifest religious worlds. A pure power is present here, which is absent from everything that we can actually know as God, a power not only irresistible, but which we deeply seek. I mean, the whole world there is just like, this should mess us up a little bit. I don't, there's not a peace here, as Caputo would say, there's a chaos. That's a core, a good thing that we move towards, we're seeking, even though it's highly disruptive, which is the alienation McGowan talks about. So, I mean, I see all these worlds colliding. It's like my head is like,
yeah. Yes, all these thinkers are, we're making connections. There's all these similarities and lines that we can be drawn. So perfect. That's a beautiful place to end. Then next week is just a seminar. I'm going to do a wee bit more on communion and community. Then a Zoom discussion on that, and then back to the reading. So a quick show of hands. Do you want to do then chapter 3? We talked about evil. I mean, it sounds like, yeah, that's the best thing to do. We'll do at least that chapter, and if we're really enjoying it, hey, we'll do the whole thing. Okay, have a great night, everybody. Take care. Bye.